All right, so before we get into our next group of muscles, the hypaxial muscles of the ventral body walls, we've got to talk about something called the rectus sheath. All right, so this is a point where four of the abdominopelvic wall muscles will fuse. All right, so this is an extended aponeurosis. All right, so remember what aponeurosis means? That is like a sheet-like tendon, right? So that means it's made out of dense, regular connective tissue. So it's a sheet-like tendon of the external oblique, internal oblique, transverse abdominis muscles. Those three out of the four abdominopelvic wall muscles. All right. Now, the fourth one is the rectus abdominis, and this rectus sheath is actually going to enclose that entire muscle. All right. Now, if you're looking at this sheath, we can see that sort of at the midline, it kind of gets a little bit thicker. And you can see that here. We call that the linea alba, and that literally just translates to white line. That will be a common insertion of some of these muscles. So we got to keep that in mind. And we can see that this sheath actually does extend from the xiphoid process of the sternum all the way down to the pubic symphysis of the pubis bone. All right. So we just want to keep this in mind as we're introducing the first four muscles of the abdominopelvic wall. So another thing to keep in mind, though, as we continue on, is that we are dealing with hypaxial muscles, which means we are now ventral, we are now anterior to the transverse processes of the vertebrae. All right, so the first four muscles that we'll talk about in this group are going to be along the anterior wall of the abdominopelvic cavity. All right. The final one of this first group, quadratus lumborum, this one is kind of an oddball. If I was looking at my lab manual, I'd put maybe like a little asterisk next to that one. It's not really, it's only grouped with this, with these other four muscles because of its innervation and because it is technically hypaxial, but we'll talk about it more in a moment. So, looking at our first muscle, the rectus abdominis. So, this muscle, again, is enclosed by the rectus sheath. All right. And we have these arrows here to kind of show us the way that the muscle fibers are going to be pointing. All right. So, it is going from bottom to up, signifying that the origin is going to be inferior here. Right, so the origin of the rectus abdominis is going to be the pubis bone. All right, so you can see that inferiorly here. All right, and this is the traditional, six pack of, your abdomen. That's what you would be viewing, the rectus abdominis. In terms of insertions, it's going to insert up onto the sacrum, as you can see here, as well as the costal cartilage. So remember, costal cartilage is the cartilage that connects the ribs to the sternum. So it inserts along the costal cartilage of ribs 5 through 7. And we can actually see that here, 5, 6, and then 7. All right. So we have origin, inferior, and insertion superior. So remember, we got to envision this muscle contracting and getting shorter. And so it's going to be pulling as it gets shorter, it'll pull at the insertion. So it's going to be moving this entire superior portion of your trunk towards your legs. All right. And so this kind of gives it a flexing movement. If you envision your body laying flat on the ground, or you lay down on the ground right now, and then try to flex your trunk, right? So bring your head, bring your shoulders up towards your leg. All right, you're essentially doing an abdominal crunch, right? If you remember gym class from like high school, and we had to do like that whole pacer exam. And anyways, I don't know if they still do it, but you have to do these crunches and see how long you can go. And it was the worst. But anyways, what you're actually contracting, what muscle you're using is your rectus abdominis. All right. Now, also, an action of this muscle is going to be compress abdominal viscera. All right. And you'll notice that that is an action that's shared for the first four muscles of these groups. All right. To compress the abdominal viscera, what we mean by that is kind of enacting that rectus sheath, and you're flattening your abdominal area, right? So you're just kind of making everything really tight, kind of squeezing in your abdomen, flexing your abdomen as much as you can, making it really tight. Okay, that is enacting your rectus sheath, and that's what we call compressing the abdominal viscera. All right, so let's talk innervation for the rectus abdominis. And this innervation is actually shared among all of the muscles of this group, but it does get altered for a few of them. We'll talk more about it. The innervation is the thoracic ventral rami of the spinal nerves. So with the epaxial muscles, we were talking about the dorsal rami, so that branch off the spinal nerve that was moving towards the posterior side of the body. But now we're on the anterior side of the body, right? So we need the ventral branch. So this is going to be technically the thoracic ventral branch or ventral rami that are going to be stimulating and contracting these muscles. All right. Now, for the next one, we have it's called the external obliques. Okay, and so we do have two of them on either side of our body, and we can notice the fiber direction, the fascicle direction is going inferior, but also medial. So you can see it's coming towards the medial line. And so we do consider, or say like a little trick to remember this is you go from X, like external, to sex. So you're pointing towards your sex organs. Okay. So from X to sex, that's your external oblique, and that's how you can follow those fibers. All right. So for the external oblique, it's going to originate on the lower 8 ribs. All right. So you can see it originating here. And so that's why it's good to know the direction of your fibers. They're coming from point A to point B, from X towards the sex. So we can know that the origins are going to be over here. And so that can kind of get you, a good guess, or, maybe process of elimination if you are faced with a multiple choice question. All right. So then the insertion is going to be along the iliac crest, and you can kind of see a little bit of that here from the lateral view, and as well as the linea alba, right? So that center medial portion of that rectus sheath, that white line, that thicker part along your medial line. All right. So that is the linea alba. So it's also going to be inserting there. All right. So again, the action shared amongst the other ones, compress and support the abdominal viscera. Fantastic. It is also going to contribute to flexing the trunk, but more so, it's going to help with rotating the trunk. So, because we have muscles on both sides, if we are rotating our trunk to one side, we're enacting our external oblique. If we're doing it to the other side, then we're enacting that on the other pair of the external oblique on the other side of the body. All right, and the innervation is the same as the rectus abdominis, the thoracic ventral rami of the spinal nerves. So a lot of similarities here, but it's mostly looking at the direction of the fibers. right? And kind of following that so that we have a kind of an idea of where the origin could be and the insertion. And just by looking at these imagery, we can pretty much get a good idea. And luckily for us, there are a lot of similarities between these four abdominal pelvic muscles. So even if we don't have an image in front of us, we should be able to, find some commonalities and be able to study these properly. Now, the next one is deep to the external oblique. So we took the external oblique off, and now we have the view of the internal obliques. So we can see that the internal obliques, I kind of cut this off just a little bit just so we could have it fit. But you can still see from this lateral view of the internal obliques, you can still see the direction of the fibers. So origin would be assumed down here and insertion up here. So it's going in the opposite direction of the external, right? External was moving inferior and medial. Now we're going superior and medial. So for internal oblique, the little trick to remember is you're going in to the chin. All right, so in to the chin. All right. So for the internal oblique, we have kind of a new term, the thoracolumbar fascia, and we'll go over this in a moment, but it's essentially the posterior region of the body, and we can actually see it more on the on this image since I cut this image off, but it is essentially this fascia here posterior in the thoracic and lumbar region. All right, so that's the thoracolumbar fascia, and that is an origin point for the internal oblique. As well as we can see from here on this lateral view, the iliac crest is also going to be an origin point, and the inguinal ligament. Okay, so that ligament is actually going to run from the anterior and inferior iliac spine, I believe, to the pubic tubercle. Okay, so it's going to be running anterior on the ilium to the pubic tubercle on the pubis bone. All right, and that ligament, the inguinal ligament, is actually going to form that the quote unquote V that you see on potentially male models or male or female bodybuilders. It is more obvious on males just because females typically will have more adipose connective tissue, loose adipose connective tissue in this region. Okay. So for the insertion of the internal oblique, we can see that it's going to be up along ribs 10 through 12, excuse me. So you can see here. And then also going to be inserting at the linea alba. All right, so that white line, that rectus sheath. Okay, and again, compress and support the abdominal viscera is an action shared by the other two we've already talked about. It's also going to contribute to flex and rotate. It has the exact action of the external oblique. Okay, so exact action of the external oblique, but more so the insertion of the external oblique is the origin of the internal oblique. Right, so keeping that in mind. Now, the internal oblique, this is where the innervation changes. Okay, we're still dealing with the thoracic ventral rami of the spinal nerves, but now we're also looking at these muscles being innervated by the thoracic and the lumbar ventral rami of the spinal nerves. Okay, so once we get to the internal obliques, it's not just the thoracic, it's also the thoracic and lumbar ventral rami. All right. Then we can move on to our fourth and final abdominal pelvic body wall muscle, right? Because remember, the fifth one is kind of an oddball. We put an asterisk next to it. So we'll say that this one's the fourth and final one of this grouping, essentially. The transverse abdominis has, again, a similar origin to the internal oblique, the thoracolumbar fascia. So again, it is this fascia found in the thoracic and lumbar region. So we can see this origin here. Now, transverse abdominis, this should, kind of help us out right there in the name, recognizing that it's going to be, the fibers are going to be running along the same transverse plane, right? So kind of cutting the body in half to have a top and a bottom, an inferior and superior portion. Okay, so transverse abdominis. So as well as the thoracocolumbar fascia, this muscle is also going to originate along the iliac crest and the inguinal ligament. So very similar to the origin of the internal oblique. The only difference is that transverse abdominis is also going to insert along the lower 6 ribs. Okay, so it's also going to insert on these lower ribs. Okay, the insertion is only going to be that linea alba, that part of the rectus sheath. And the action is only going to be to compress and support the abdominal viscera. All right, so not too much new stuff to learn for the transverse abdominis. So far, it's only that new origin point, the lower 6 ribs, that's really been different or new from the internal or the external or rectus abdominis. Okay, the transverse abdominis is also going to have the thoracic and lumbar rami, ventral rami of the spinal nerves innervate this muscle. So again, very similar to the internal oblique. So I've said this word fascia a few times, referring to the thoracolumbar fascia. If we don't remember, but a fascia is essentially dense, irregular connective tissue that is going to be wrapping around muscle bundles, around muscle fibers. Every single muscle fiber and fascicle and actual muscle bundle itself is going to be wrapped in this sheet of dense, irregular connective tissue. And so it basically is just enclosing and stabilizing and separating all of these different structures. It can provide some support and also allows other structures to anchor to these muscles. So you can see if you get ever like a piece of meat, you can kind of pull this layer off of it, this coating, and that would be the fascia. Or you can look at all the marbling that you see, fascia. Okay, so it's kind of separating these groups, all right, of the cut of the meat into different groups and whatnot. Again, enclosing, different regions, different structures of the muscle. That is fascia. Now, the very last muscle of the hypaxial abdominal pelvic body wall muscles is the quadratus lumborum. And so this one is just a weird muscle. So we put an asterisk next to it because even looking at the image, right, all the other muscles in this group that we were referring to were along the anterior and maybe lateral side of the abdomen, the abdominal pelvic region. This muscle is sitting posterior. All right. So let's just first talk about its name. So quadratus, we're meaning 4 sides, and you can kind of see that it gives like a trapezoid appearance almost. So 4 sides. And then lumborium is referring to the lumbar region. So it is going to be associated with the lumbar vertebrae in some way. Okay. So it's going to be originating on the iliac crest, which we can see here, right? And then we can follow the directions of the muscle and see that it's going to be inserting up here, maybe around the last rib, rib 12. but it's also going to be inserting along the transverse processes of lower lumbar vertebrae. And you can see that more from this lateral view of it inserting along the transverse process of those lower lumbar. All right, so it is associated with some of the lumbar vertebrae, so lumborium. It has 4 sides, so quadratus. All right, but it's such a weirdo because it is posterior. Okay, so because it's not anterior and it's more so on the posterior side of the abdomen, it's going to share similar actions with those epaxial muscles. All right. It is still hypaxial, right? It is anterior to the transverse process. We can see that transverse process, anterior. Okay. So it is anterior. So it is hypaxial, but because it's on the posterior side of the body, it shares actions that are really similar to the epaxial. So it's going to be extending the vertebral column. It's going to be flexing the vertebral column on one side or the other, depending on where you contract. All right, so very similar to the epaxial muscles. But it's grouped with the other 4 because if we look at the innervation, the thoracic and lumbar ventral rami are going to be, of the spinal nerves, are going to be contracting the quadratus lumborium. Okay.